I grew up on the outskirts of a small southern town, so I spent most days of my summer vacations prowling the woods close to my home. After about half-hour walk from my house, down dirt roads and overgrown deer trails, there was a sandy stretch of beach along a creek. Since it was so far removed from civilization, I had never seen another soul out there at the creek. I would often strip down naked and swim in the water to cool down under the summer sun. When I was a young girl, about 8 or 9 years old, I had gone down to my secret beach to go skinny dipping. I had spent all morning there, watching herons splashing in the water happily. Suddenly I began to hear the sounds of something large forcing its way through the undergrowth upstream a ways. I was frozen, standing naked in the middle of the creek as 2 men emerged from the woods. They were much older than me, probably in their 30s. Something about the way they were dressed scared me. Anyone who has spent a lot of time in the woods knows the danger of thorn vines and brambles, but these guys were dressed in flip-flops, cargo shorts, and wife-beaters. They were filthy and covered in scratches across their arms and legs, looking as if hiking through the woods hadn't ever been on their agenda. I had left my clothes in an untidy pile on the bank, but to grab them, I would have had to move much closer to the men. As I frantically tried to think of a way to get back to my clothes without alerting these guys, one of them turned and locked eyes with me. I grew up around southern manners, seeing as I was a naked girl trying to cover myself with my hands as I stood in the middle of a creek. I would have expected him to avert his gaze, but all he did was elbow his buddy in the ribs, point at me, and whisper something beyond my hearing. When they both turned and began to advance towards me, malicious grins on their faces, I officially lost my shit. Luckily, years of spending all my free time in the woods paid off. Forgetting modesty, I turned and ran at breakneck speed for the closest downstream deep channel. As I dove into the water, I could hear the men yelling and splashing behind me, trying desperately to catch up. I had always been at home in the water, and at this moment I swam as though my life depended on it, which it very well might have. I knew exactly where I needed to go. Earlier that summer, I had discovered what I thought of as my secret hiding spot. The banks were rocky and sheer on both sides of the creek here, around the bend and downstream from the sandy beach. I had been watching muskrats swimming in the water, and had seen one swimming through hanging kudzu vines into what I thought was solid stone. Upon pulling back the vines, and scaring the shit out of the muskrat in the process, I found an open space under an overhanging rock. I had always loved hiding, and was immediately smitten with such a perfectly camouflaged spot. But weeks later, in this moment, I thought of it as my best hope. As I came close to my hiding spot, I ducked down and swam underwater to my hole in the stone. I only surfaced once I was safely behind my curtain of kudzu vines. I waited there several minutes, trying to silence my breathing and slow my rampaging heartbeat, until I heard the sounds of heavy crashing through the underbrush. I screamed a little, but thankfully had clamped a hand over my mouth in time to muffle it. As the sounds of snapping twigs and rustling leaves got closer, I could hear the men panting and cursing under their breath. It sounded as if they were walking on the edge of the bank a few feet above me. After they had moved down a ways, I heard a thud on the ground and an angry yell, as if one of the men had tripped and fallen. Another voice shushed him and said something that made me tremble. "Shut up, she'll hear you." I had never been more terrified at that moment. I cried silently, pressing my back against a rock and praying they wouldn't find me. Even after I heard their footsteps continuing down the bank and into silence, I remained hidden behind the kudzu. I stayed there, delirious with fear and shivering in the water, until the sun had begun to dip low in the sky. I finally began to make my way back to get my clothes and go home, picking my way along deer trails that would let me move as silently as possible. When I had gotten close to the beach, I stayed hidden in the undergrowth and watched for several minutes to make sure those two slime balls weren't anywhere around. Thankfully, although I found several footprints circling my clothes and pacing along the bank, the guys were nowhere to be seen. My shirt and jeans were still there, luckily, but my panties were gone. I threw my clothes on and ran the whole way home. I never told my mother about what happened at the creek, because I knew she would ban me from ever going into the woods again. I never saw those guys again, nor did I even see anyone else down at that stretch of beach after that. Needless to say, I never went skinny dipping again. So, creepy man who would chase a naked little girl through the woods, let's not meet. This took place several years ago, when I was only 18 and freshly enrolled in college. I grew up in an extremely strict household, Asian female, by the way. My parents set my curfew at 8 p.m. I wasn't allowed to drive at night, or go to parties, etc. All because my family was convinced that all of these situations led to rape. Anyway, you could see how once I moved out of the house, I relished any opportunity to exercise my new freedom and independence. One night at around 11 p.m. I got super hungry and had a real craving for an Arby's roast beef sandwich. My roommate was tired and didn't want to go with, so I hopped in my car and decided to make a quick trip by myself. To get to Arby's, I had to take a stretch of road that was really secluded and not well lit. Of course, at that time of night, there were barely any cars on the road. At a stoplight just a few blocks from the Arby's, I was the third car waiting at a red light. Car A was in the very front, Car B was behind it, and I was behind Car B. The last car, Car C, that was behind me. All of a sudden, I guess he must have thought the light turned, but it was still red. The car in front of me stepped on the gas and lurched forward, tapping the back of the car in front of him. The two drivers immediately got out and started looking at the damage. Neither of them were hurt, and there was little to no damage that I could see made to either car. I had no idea what to do in that situation. Again, I was a dumb 18-year-old, just ejected into the adult world, and I had never witnessed an accident of any kind before. Was I supposed to stick around as a witness or something? I wasn't sure. But I felt very uneasy about the idea of getting out my car in the middle of the night on a really isolated road to talk to these two guys, especially when I didn't think they needed my intervention at all. Again, it was a super minor fender bender, and they were talking about it civilly, though they didn't move their cars. So when the light turned green, I decided to just move over into the other lane and proceed on my way. Again, this may have been the wrong thing to do, but I didn't know any better. The car that had been behind me did not like that I was trying to leave. To this day, I have no idea what they were thinking. At the time, I thought that they must have thought I caused the accident, or something. Anyway, as I shifted over to the other lane to leave, they started blasting their horn at me. I got super scared and proceeded down the road past the green light, and the car, Car C, the one behind me, took off after me. What ensued was still the most terrifying experience I've ever had. The car, which I could only dimly see had two male figures in the front seat, followed me closely for quite a while, occasionally blasting their horn aggressively. They would speed up until they were about to hit the back of my car. I was starting to get really freaked out, so I started making random turns to lose them, or to see if they were really following me. They definitely were. I made 3 left turns and they were still on my tail. Eventually the car pulled over into the lane beside me, and kept speeding up and nudging into my lane, as if to cut me off or run me off the road. I was actually crying now, and I had called my then boyfriend, telling him what was happening. I initially wanted to drive to his house, but then I realized I didn't want these psychos knowing where he lived. I tried to avoid making eye contact with the two men in the car beside me, and tried not to let them intimidate me off the road. They kept blaring the horn, and then eventually the driver rolled down the window. I was too scared to talk to him, but I could hear what he screamed clearly through my window, which had a slight gap in the top that never sealed up.
"We're gonna catch you, bitch! I'm gonna rip your dumb ass!"
I think the guy next to him says something like, "Don't slow down," or something. But I couldn't hear it as clearly over the rushing of the wind and the sounds of our cars accelerating. My boyfriend heard them shouting from over the phone and directed me to the nearest police station, which was about 8 minutes away from where I was. It was actually hard for him to find the police station, or to give me directions to it because I had no idea where I was. The two guys kept shouting things at me, but I don't know what else was said because I was too busy blubbering to my boyfriend. Maybe it's really hard to remember what went on in these moments physically. I was speeding so fast to try to get away from these guys at this point that I was hoping a cop would stop me. There were no cars on any of the roads we went down, and it just made everything worse and worse. And then my phone battery decided it was time to die. I seriously thought I was in one of the horror stories my parents had always told me about. Eventually I saw the police station my boyfriend had given me directions to, almost drove past it, and turned into the parking lot. The car followed me and the passenger door actually opened before the car even stopped. But then I think they noticed where they were, and they drove out of there, fast. I sat in my car, too terrified to get out because I thought moving would provoke them into coming back. Literally 60 seconds later, my boyfriend pulled into the parking lot next to my car and climbed out with a baseball bat. He held me for a while, and then a cop who was pulling into the lot, or something, coming out of the building, approached us and asked us if everything was okay. It turns out that the car that had tailed me fit the description of a car that had apparently scared the girl so badly, same type of thing, late night, empty road, lone driver, super aggressive driving and screaming, that she crashed her car into a tree in a divider trying to get away from these guys. Neither she nor I got a license plate though, and to this day, I don't know if they ever caught those guys. I don't know what kind of human being gets their kicks out of terrorizing female drivers late at night on the road. But whoever they were, fuck those guys. I hope someone, somewhere, managed to put a stop to them. When I was young, my mother and I took the bus a lot because she didn't have a car. This incident happened during that stretch of time. More specifically, when I was around age 5 or 6. We were at the closest bus stop to my house, which is situated right next to a fairly large tree. I remember it being a pretty nice afternoon, bright and breezy, and my mom was reading one of her paperback novels while I inspected the trunk of the tree for small lizards. We lived in Florida, which is swarming with anoles. I was really into animals back then, and I loved pretending I was tracking down dangerous critters like Steve Irwin. My search was proving to be kind of fruitless though, since I was making a lot of noise by stomping around, and I'm sure any lizards nearby had heard me and were already well hidden from the grasp of my chubby little hands. Nevertheless, I kept up the hunt and eventually, forgetting that I was supposed to stay within my mother's line of sight, went around the other side of the tree to look. The bench Mom was sitting on was now out of my view, and she, likewise, wouldn't have been able to see me if she looked up. She was quite absorbed into her book, however, and thus wouldn't be aware of what was going on until it was almost too late. as I scrabbled about on my hands and knees in the grass by the tree. I heard light footsteps coming up a ways behind me, and turned around to see a man making his way towards me. I don't remember much about how he looked, but I know he seemed very tall. The way the sun was facing placed most of his frame in the shadow of the tree, which gives my recollection of him a vaguely surreal quality. At the time, though, he was just a man who was looking at me. He greeted me warmly as I stared up at him, and asked me what I was doing outside all alone. I guess he hadn't seen my mother because of the tree, and thought I was unsupervised. I'd always been a shy child, particularly around adults, so I didn't respond, choosing to continue looking at him. I was a little wary, but he didn't seem like a threat, and it was the middle of the afternoon. He seemed to take my silence as a confirmation of his assumption, because he followed up his previous question by telling me he was taking a walk and asking me if I'd like to join him to get some ice cream. He didn't wait for me to answer this time, but continued a gentle stream of words, saying he liked my dress and wanted to be my friend. As he was speaking, I noticed that he was slowly stepping closer and closer to me. I was beyond mere wariness at this point, and my mind was sliding towards something more akin to alarm. But I didn't know if I'd be able to run away from him before he could reach me. My family had always warned me not to go anywhere with strangers, and the serious concern on their faces when they told me had made me certain that following an unknown person was a very scary bad thing, even if I wasn't old enough to understand why at the time. When the man was within arm's length of me, he reached out his hand and brushed the tips of his fingers against my shoulder. I'll never forget that moment. How my bubble of personal space had been pressed inward and then pierced. Whatever spell of silence I had been under was immediately broken, and I screamed as loud as I could, twisting violently away from his hand. The man flinched and froze, seeming to calculate what his next move would be, now that I was proving to be less of an easy target than he expected. His decision was made for him when my mom, jolted out of her reading by my cry, appeared from around the other side of the tree and spotted us. She screeched at him. I've never seen her that angry again in all my life, and he immediately spun to flee without a word. A shiny black car that I hadn't noticed before was parked on the side of the road, a pretty good distance away from us. And when the man reached it, he got into it quickly and sped off. He never paused to start it up, which means it must have been running the entire time it was sitting there. This small detail didn't mean much to my immature mind at the time, but remembering it now gives me chills. It's pretty obvious that he wasn't just some friendly guy on a stroll who happened upon a lonely child. He had spied me from the road, stopped his car, and left it running for a speedy getaway once he'd snatched me up. I can only imagine where he truly would have taken me if I hadn't alerted my mom or put up a fight. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to episode 48. Just want to say I appreciate the great feedback you gave me on my Tinder video. And as can occasionally happen with these things, because I sent so many messages out just to make sure I got the 3 responses back, after I'd uploaded the video I got a few more yeses back from people. So there may be another one next week or so. I've been looking into the possibility of starting a series. What I was thinking was public domain novels, maybe just for example Bram Stoker's Dracula. Possibly, record a chapter at a time, upload it into a playlist, and the whole thing would be there once it's done for anyone who wants to listen to it all at once. Let me know what you think of the idea. The material's interesting enough, and who doesn't like vampires?
You seek to baffle me. With your pale faces all in a row, like sheep in a butcher's.
Good stuff indeed. I'd really like to do readings of some Sherlock Holmes stuff, but the copyright on that's a bit iffy. Technically, most of the stories are now in public domain. There's just a few that aren't. But the Conan Doyle estate does have a very wrong and, quite frankly, shameful history of claiming copyright and taking money from authors. I'm obviously not an author, just a narrator, but taking money from authors who've used those characters when they really had no legal right to. In fact, there was an author recently, I can't recall his name off the top of my head, who had written his Sherlock Holmes pastiche, and quite frankly, he was a little bit fed up with, having to pay over money to these people when he genuinely believed they didn't have to, so he looked into it, got the courts involved, and turns out, yeah, he was right. They've been illegally claiming royalties. That's a shitty thing to do. Anyway, I'm off to see what I'm recording for tomorrow. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.